Hello, friends. Welcome back to Reiki Crossroads and Connections, an ongoing series of conversations exploring ways that you can become rooted, spacious, connected, and to remember yourself. And we're doing this through conversations between a Reiki teacher and practitioners of a wide range of modalities and practices that have connections and overlaps with the system of Reiki in ways that benefit our day-to-day life. I love to have these kinds of conversations in my private life, and I thought that would be the perfect thing to share with all of you. Because oftentimes when we explore these points of connection between different aspects of our life, we can better bring these practices into our day-to-day life so that they can serve us more deeply. My name is Michaela, and I'm really glad to have you back with us. So today I am really pleased to bring into the studio Catherine Lao, who is in her own beautiful yoga studio just across the causeway from me in Sacramento. Catherine, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and talk to you about this. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah. We've had a variety of conversations over the last year or so about our different pathways into this work, some of the places where they connect, some of the places where they're different, and it just feels like the perfect conversation to be happening here. But to begin with, I want to just introduce you to the folks at home because you are the founder of liminalspace.net. And firstly, I have to say, I absolutely love using the term liminal space in your business because it's such a powerful invocation of experiences that we all have, this experience of being in the in-between, but that we so rarely get to put language to and get to kind of work with what that means. So you founded this organization, which is a membership-based online community committed to personal evolution through the practice of yoga and inner shadow exploration. Your interest in the what's just below the surface of thoughts, feelings, and personal stories motivated your 10 years of formal study in social psychology, yoga, and integral mindset coaching. That is a dynamic combination. I love it. Unlike many shadow workers, you see body practices as a vital component of shadow exploration and necessary for embracing and celebrating the whole self. You lead the transformational Shadow Alchemy Program, where you help people face what they judge most about themselves and make way for a deep and sustainable self-love.
Sounds so good when you read it.
It sounds so great when you wrote it.
It's even better when I do it.
Right. I want to, there's so much in here for us to discuss, but I feel like this jumping off point around this connection that you make between the body-based work, the embodiment work, and the shadow work. And so I wonder if just maybe first to kind of make sure that we're all on the same page, I'd love to just have you explain in your own words what you mean by shadow work. I feel like it's a term that can be used in a lot of different ways, and we don't always mean the same thing when we use it. So I'd love to just kind of get a baseline for what you mean when you talk about shadow work, and then we can talk about how that matters in our bodies.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the inner shadow is based on Carl Jung's idea of the inner shadow, which is essentially a part of us that we aren't aware of. And so the simplest way that I've learned to define it is it's a part of ourselves that we don't know that causes friction in our lives. And the way that I see the body work and the shadow work that I do is they're not mutually exclusive. Yoga, and if you've been practicing yoga for a while, you've probably been doing this already, doing some shadow exploration without even realizing it. Yoga is a practice that allows you to feel into parts of yourself that you haven't noticed before. And doing shadow discovery typically is about theory, is looking at the stories that we live in and the stories that we tell ourselves that we are, who we are and who we aren't. And to do that and leave out the yoga part of it, the bodywork part of it, to me is only doing part of shadow exploration. They really work together. So I see yoga, for me, in the way that I work with my clients and my students, I see yoga as a tool to explore shadow.
Nice. I would imagine that the opposite is also true, to do yoga or embodiment based practices and to ignore the presence of shadow in our life would possibly also not be a complete practice or giving us a complete service. Yeah.
Yeah, I was teaching a yoga class the other day. I do a regular yoga class in Land Park here in Sacramento. And one of my students was there, and she had done my shadow program about a year ago, the Shadow Alchemy Program. And I heard her telling another student, and she's a teacher. So the student that I was overhearing is also a teacher and a student of mine. And I overheard her telling somebody else that it wasn't until she did the Shadow Alchemy Program that she really understood what she was doing in yoga. It gave her a way to see, this is why I'm doing the work. This is what's happening. And it gave her a purpose to it. So I really loved hearing that, because what you're saying is exactly right. You can go through the movements, but if you're not being cued into paying attention, deeper attention to what's happening in your body, then it's really easy to miss things and not notice things. And that essentially, what we don't notice becomes shadow, or what we avoid becomes shadow.
I love that description of it. And firstly, that the way that you're talking about that connection brings to mind the words of a mentor of mine, Norma Wong, who was fond of saying that the body, mind, and heart are hardwired together, and to behave as if they're not is to severely limit our potential. And that just always sticks with me. And it's like limiting our potential across the board in whatever way we are trying to be our full self, our best self, to succeed. We're limiting our potential if we ignore these connections between these vital aspects of ourself. And I love the way that you talk about shadow as a part of ourself that's causing friction, or where there's friction between that part of ourself and the rest of us, those places that we've ignored. Because that kind of languaging avoids what I often see as this dualistic language that shadow is bad and light is good. And
Mm.
that we should therefore probably do whatever we can to move towards the light and away from the shadow, which of course gives us permission to not deal with the friction that's present, right? And so I wanted to, because that was another piece that really stood out to me from my experience. I started encountering the idea of shadow work and the necessity of working with all of the parts of ourself and naming them and befriending them and learning what they are there to teach us and what they need. And to regard those frictioned parts of ourselves not as bad categorically, but in need of something, in need of attention. And that friction is there because there's something that's not being addressed that needs to be. So I started doing that work with the organization that I did my teacher training with at the same time that I was starting to work with Reiki. And as I've shared on this channel many times, I began working with Reiki in the Western model. That is very much, many times, not universally, not for everybody, but for many people and within many Reiki communities, is very much tied with the kind of love and light perspective that the goal is to shine light on everything and to lean into affirmations and to lean into positivity and to use that kind of strategy to almost burn away the shadow without actually navigating it. And I've seen a lot of really negative outcomes from that perspective, both in terms of our internal work, the ways that doesn't allow us to really deal with some things that we need to, and in interpersonally, in the way in which that can become a reason to shame a person for bringing up some of the harder aspects of life. And so I'm just curious what your relationship is with that dynamic. And as a person who's out there in the world, in public, in your business, in your practice, speaking to the need to do shadow work, if you run into any friction in the outside world around that work.
Oh my goodness, there is so much to say about everything that you just said. There's a million layers. I have 5,000 different answers. And so I think the way to simplify it so that my mind doesn't explode with excitement on all the different things that you just mentioned is to kind of go back in time to see where this started with me. And I think that sharing my story will help create a picture for this, and it'll come back to everything that you're saying right now and addressing everything that you're saying. It's one of those things where your life creates your work, right? So your experiences that happen in life end up creating what you do. When I was 8, my mother died of ALS. She was
Mm.
very sick. She had ALS. I was living in Las Vegas with my older brother and my father. And my father left us right after she passed away. And so my brother and I were sent to San Francisco to live with extended family members, which were kind enough to bring us in. It was a very loving home. We got a great education, a beautiful house to live in. But there was this mindset of, if we were upset, I think there was this kind of fantasy that they lived in, and they were going to take us in, and it was going to be this beautiful, Disney story about raising these kids, and they would be, feel really good about it, and we'd be really grateful. But my brother and
We
I were,
wouldn't be part of that picture, right? That wouldn't
it
be
sounds
there.
great.
Yeah.
The problem is, the reality of that, what happened is my brother and I were very traumatized by everything that just happened. I did not understand that my mother was sick. I didn't know that what was going to happen was her death. We were there when she died, so it was very shocking. Of course, we didn't know that my dad was going to leave. So it was just like we were both in this state of shock. And so what my new family received were very traumatized little children. And so if I would act out, either in rage or grief, or however a young child expresses themselves when they're feeling very confusing emotions like that, I would be met with, I don't know why you're upset. You should be grateful that this is where you get to live. You get to live in this town, you get a loving home, you're not in an orphanage. And so indirectly, without me, unconsciously, without me really knowing it, I got into this good or bad, right or wrong state of mind, as you mentioned earlier, where I thought, okay, these negative emotions I'm feeling are bad, and I should be really grateful. So I should only be grateful for what it is. What I didn't know at the time is my new family, I love them dearly, but they were very comfortable with the elephant in the living room. There was a lot of now what I can identify as toxic positivity, to just make sure that you're happy, dust yourself off, don't feel those emotions. Why are you crying? It was that kind of mentality. And not that they meant to do that to me, but that's what they were raised in as well. So that's what was familiar to them.
Yeah, that was the strategy that they had learned to make themselves be okay, and that's obviously what they would want to pass along. Yeah.
Absolutely. And they weren't equipped to handle 2 children who were traumatized. So in some ways it was about making them comfortable as well. And so that's essentially what I learned, is how can I make other people comfortable? Because as a child, it's about survival, right? Like, I need to make accepted in this house. If I don't have this family, what do I have? And so don't be angry, don't be upset. But I had those feelings. And so I just shoved them down and sent them into what I call the shadow caves. So, Robert Bly talks about there's this invisible bag behind us, and we go through life learning about what we're allowed to be. That's our persona. And what we're not allowed to be, that's our shadow. And we take those fragmented parts of ourselves and we put it in this invisible bag. And he said that by the time we're in high school, that invisible bag that we carry behind us is miles long, full of all these fragmented parts of ourselves. So I grew up thinking that I was supposed to be grateful, that I should be appreciative. Affirmations were a big part of my family. They loved having Post-it notes with affirmations around. And this all felt really uncomfortable for me. So fast forward, I get into my late teens and I start getting into drugs. And now I can see that I was very attracted to stimulants. And I think what was happening is I bifurcated so much of my emotional body and my connection to my actual physical body that I didn't really have much feeling anymore. And I think part of my attraction to stimulants was me, in a young, naive way, trying to feel myself again. And so then I get into my 20s, I get in relationships. I'm very angry in these relationships, but I don't want to show anger. So I'm basically very cut off from, the people in my life, and essentially cut off from myself. And so in my late 20s, I started going to therapy. And when I called him for the first time, he asked, "What are you coming for?" And I said, "I think I might be apathetic. I just jumped out of an airplane at 14,000 feet. And I felt nothing by the time I landed." My friend was super excited. She went on the same plane, but with a different person, tandem. And when she landed, she was excited. And I remember having to act like I was excited to meet her level of excitement. And that really worried me. So I contacted a therapist, and he would sit there and say, well, how do you feel? You know, when I would talk about my childhood, how do you feel about that? Where do you feel that in your body? And I had zero understanding of what he was talking about because I was so disconnected from my body. And now probably I see that I was disassociating a lot as well.
Yeah.
And so then he suggested that I try yoga. So I started practicing yoga. And then all of a sudden, after practicing probably for about 6 months really consistently, I remember walking up the hill. The studio was about 4 blocks downhill. I was living in San Francisco, and walking up the hill to my house. And all of a sudden, I was noticing my heartbeat, and I was feeling my legs, like the strength in my legs and the muscles working my legs. And I was feeling these feelings that I think now were probably joy for the first time, noticing what that felt like. And joy for no other reason but to the fact that I felt my body.
Yeah.
And so I did yoga for a little while, but I kept finding myself in Shavasana crying, or coming home and feeling really depressed for a couple of days and not understanding what that was about. And it wasn't until I was introduced to Carl Jung and his idea of the inner shadow that I really started to reveal myself to me. It gave me an understanding of what I was feeling and how I had bifurcated this part of myself and why I had done it, and how I thought that there were parts of me that weren't allowed to exist in the world. And so it was through the combination of yoga and shadow discovery that I understood that I can simultaneously be grateful and be sad and grieving at the same time. And that is the healthiest way for me to be, to embrace this multifaceted version of myself and the duality of our existence, which includes suffering and joy, which includes being selfish and being selfless. And so I started to look at these different parts of myself and invite them back into my experience so that I wasn't blindsided. When I talk about this friction, the friction is how ignoring these parts of yourselves plays out in your life. So this example I was talking about of like doing drugs, that's creating friction in my life. Not being emotionally available in my relationships, that creates friction in my life. Not being emotionally available to myself, that creates friction in my life. And so it took me having the courage to look at the parts that I wasn't really wanting to look at. And in that, harmony starts to come in to play because we accept those parts of ourselves.
Yeah. Oof.
And I have a lot to say based on your opening, but I just want to take pause here so you
Yeah.
can digest what I'm saying.
I really appreciate that, and getting to, feel a bit of the story arc, if you will, the landscape of what brings you to this work now, because there's so much nuance and subtlety to the way that you're working in this realm that is so necessary and is just not always present. And this, I mean, similarly, as you were speaking, I'm like, oh, this and this point, that one, and I want to say that, and so like where to begin, this idea of, so the system of Reiki from its Japanese origins is built on a foundation of Shinto and esoteric Buddhist practice. And so inside of that, concepts like non-duality and non-attachment are essential. And, oftentimes these are very esoteric concepts. It can be like, well, what does that mean? And what does that have to do with my life? And so I love bringing it down to like, well, this is what it has to do with our life. And so what a beautiful and poignant and painful description of a duality, right? Either you're grateful or you're sad, either you're happy or you're not. And we want to be over here, so we can't be over here. And, we're going to put in structures to make sure that our attention is over here and not over here, because that's bad and this is good. And so often we live like that. We divide the world into good and bad, safe or unsafe, like me or not like me. It's part of our survival system. It's part of how we quickly assess our situation. And, it's part of the strategy that we've used to survive as a species. And, when our basic security and survival is met, it doesn't serve us well to divide everything out like that. And it certainly doesn't serve us psychologically and emotionally to do that. because we're so much bigger than that. We have so much more capacity to be with the totality of who we are and what we're experiencing without having to shame or make wrong or pack away, as you're saying, the parts of ourself that don't fit well in a given situation. And, practicing the system of Reiki, one of the things that is the most evident in my day-to-day life, like in my mind, like what I can clearly identify as a tremendous value to my life, is the sensation of being big enough to hold all of the complexity of who I am and what life is and all of the feelings about all of the things, and to really resist that idea that I only get to be one or the other and I have to choose how I'm going to feel. And what that does so often is it cuts us off from joy, because if we're going to shut down pain and grief and sadness and that side of ourself, then, as you're describing, right, dissociation is inevitable. We can't cut that part out without cutting out our sense of joy, of compassion, of connection. And so that moment, when you're walking up the hill and your body's coming back to you and joy is the natural response, that's such a clear, it's just so clear. I'm teaching a class right now on the Book of Joy and walking through all of the practices in that book that are designed to put us back in touch with that inherent state of joyful being that we are, with the premise that joy is part of our true self. It's part of who we naturally are. It's always available to us no matter what's going on. And it requires us to take that non-dualistic view that says, I can be absolutely joyful even in the midst of some straight bullshit that's happening in my life. Even in the midst of difficult things, I can touch that place. And being in good relationship with our shadow is part of that. And that's part of what really jumped out from what you were sharing.
I think what you're saying is so important, because when you talk about this idea of you can have joy and then still have the harshness of life happen, it's so true. And what I consider the shadow mindset is that idea of black and white. So once I started to do shadow discovery and combine that with yoga, it was this understanding of like, I can be completely grateful to the family that I had and the life that I had. And I can also hold space for the trauma that I went through, and the sadness and the grief and the desire to miss something. And I'm not running from one. And when I talk about that friction, the friction is created when I'm trying to ignore one only, right? And so you talked about affirmations, and I have such a big response to affirmations because as a child, I had these Post-it notes around with all these affirmations about what I should be and how I should be feeling. And I had such a rejection to them. And part of it was because when I'm saying an affirmation to myself, if the story in my mind is that I'm not worth this affirmation, I can repeat this thing over and over and over and over. It doesn't matter until I'm able to look at the story of why I'm not worthy. Right. And that's where to me, shadow discovery is. It's like looking at the part that you judge the most about yourself, which sounds really scary. You asked me earlier how people meet me in this conversation, like when I start talking to them. And usually I get people who are either like, yes, I need to do that because there's friction in their life they can't ignore anymore. Or there's people like, that sounds good, but I'm just going to like walk over here and look at, be more positive. Right. And I bless them and send them off and tell them that I'm here and ready when they are, because I don't feel like we always need to be doing this at all times. Right. To me, shadow discovery is a lifetime thing. It's a lifestyle. I've been studying it for 20 years. I've been teaching it for 20 years. I'm still very actively practicing it myself. I'm finding shadows all the time. And the Shadow Alchemy program that I teach a methodology so that you can go through when friction happens. Okay, here's the step-by-step process to discover why that friction is in place. What's happening? What's that thing that I'm not noticing about myself that's participating to the creation of this friction, so that you can keep working it. And now I'm at the point where that process just happens in my head so quickly, and then it happens in my body because I know the body practices, that I'm able to integrate my shadows more skillfully than I ever have before. And hopefully people that work with me are able to do the same thing. That's the goal of it. But it's not something that we have to be doing at all times. It's just a tool that's here. So when friction happens, okay, great. I know how to do that and deal with that, as opposed to I'm off, on some crazy overreaction, reactive, rant that can, sometimes happen and take us away, and that friction takes place. And I'm also not ignoring it either, because that, as much in your work, haunts us later on in terms of physically how we feel or energetically how we feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we're not projecting that onto other people, right? I mean, there's a self-responsibility piece of that, that beautiful and painful concept that it's not our fault if traumatic things happen to us, but it is our responsibility to understand it and to work with it so that we're not externalizing it to other people and continuing that cycle. And this tension around affirmations I find so interesting. I think that affirmations can be really powerful, but they're very misunderstood. And I think they're often seen in certain communities or certain ways of thinking as almost a cure-all, like you apply an affirmation to eradicate negative thoughts or to eradicate negative outcomes in your life. But, I really had to confront that dynamic when I was learning EFT, when I was learning about tapping, where you have, and now that I also teach that practice, I often run into resistance to the structure where you're naming the negative thing that you're experiencing very explicitly, and you're telling the truth about that negative thing as clearly as you can, while stimulating meridians using gentle tapping. And you're doing that so that the shadow that's back here in the backpack that's causing friction can come out into the light of day and be seen and be known by you and be acknowledged by you as true and important, right? And just as a fact, not a bad fact, not a good fact, a fact. And oftentimes what I run into is, but can't we say the good thing? Shouldn't we be using affirmations instead of saying the bad thing? And what I learned for myself and learned to share with other people is that if we just, I think you kind of said this, if we just say the good thing, but we're not addressing what's lurking back here, then we're just covering it up. We're just putting a Band-Aid over it. Maybe we're putting blinders on that have those words or those ideas. But it's not going to penetrate, or it has much less chance of penetrating into our heart, into our soul, into our behavior, right? Because affirmations are so much, intended to shift how we're thinking, therefore how we're feeling, therefore how we behave, what we do. It's a cascade that's supposed to lead to different outcomes in our life because of what we're, how we're behaving and how we're thinking. It can't do that if it's getting mired up in the things that we haven't acknowledged. And so it's painful, and it can feel yucky, and it can feel so counterintuitive to some people who've really internalized this message that the way that you deal with negativity is by speaking the positive as if it were so. And you speak the positive as if it were so enough times, and it will be so, right? But if we cause a wound to heal too fast on the skin and the inner layers of it have not healed, that's a recipe for deep, deep wounding and infection. And so it's like I'm feeling that in what you're saying, and the holistic, the brilliance of doing the thing that can feel very counterintuitive, of working with the thing that we don't want to look at, letting it activate in our body and moving it through our body intentionally, so that all parts of ourselves can be true at the same time. And at that point, then the affirmation can be effective, right? At that point, we can speak what we wish to be so and be well equipped to let that cascade of, our words to our thoughts, to our feelings, to our behaviors happen without it getting all mired up inside of us. I don't know if that's an analogy.
No, it's absolutely true, because it's like the idea of, I think when we try to do these positive affirmations without addressing the shadows that are lurking behind, as you put it, we run the risk of going deeper into a shadow mindset.
Mm.
because it puts us more in that mindset of like, I am, but I'm not that person. And then we move into imposter syndrome. Well, if I keep telling myself that I have all of these things, but I haven't dealt with, I'm repeating myself here, but if I haven't dealt with the ideas and the stories that I have about what I'm not, or what I'm not supposed to be, or these crappy parts about myself, then I'm never going to believe the affirmation that I'm trying to absorb. And I'm a big manifester. I believe in what is most commonly known as the law of attraction, but what you pay attention to, you give energy to,
Yeah.
and what you give energy to grows. And so I do a lot of work around creating the life that I want and feeling into the life that I want, creating the relationships that I want and feeling into the relationship that I want. But I don't think that it's possible to touch in on, because it's the emotions that you feel around that manifestation that really create that and bring it to life. And I think it's really hard to tap into the emotional part of that, the energizing force behind manifestation, if energetically you're being bogged down by your shadows and these parts of you that you think are not worthy.
Well, it's, I mean, like you said, what we pay attention to is what grows in our life. But those shadowy things, those aren't things that we're not paying attention to. We're just paying attention to them subconsciously, right? It's not our conscious mind that's paying attention to them, because we're ignoring them with our conscious mind, or maybe we're not even aware of them. But our subconscious is paying attention to them. Our body is paying attention to them, right? So attention is being paid to those things that we would rather not be manifested in our life. And that's in this direct tension to what we might be consciously trying to bring forward and trying to bring into our life. And so, by neutralizing them and beginning again with this idea that the shadow is bad and the light is good, it's like, this isn't bad. This is just me. This is just part of me that needs attention and that needs to express itself, and then maybe can rest. That part of me probably wants to rest. It keeps screaming at me from the background. Then now we don't have to pay attention to it consciously. We can shift to those positive things. So there's a completeness that I think gets missed sometimes when we want to only focus on the positive and not deal with these other things. This came up, to kind of circle it back to connections with the system of Reiki. This feels really related to a conversation that's happening in my Facebook group right now. I have an online Facebook group to discuss all things Reiki. Come on aboard. You can join, all of you listening, if you like. I'll put the link down below. But somebody asked a question about anger and in its relationship to the precepts in the system of Reiki. And for a lot of people, the precepts are affirmations. It's a series of statements that give us direction about how to be, and that describe the outcomes of practicing the system of Reiki. And it's just for today: I anger not, I worry not, I'm grateful, I'm true to myself, and I'm compassionate with myself and others. And oftentimes, from a Western mindset, those precepts are approached as affirmations, as like, you say them and then do your best to make them true. So I anger not, or I am not angry, means if I am angry, I am doing it wrong. I'm failing. So I need to stuff the anger, right? And you spoke to that when you were telling your story of, as a child, I'm supposed to be grateful, and therefore I need to stuff the anger, the grief, all of the other things. And that's often how we approach that precept. And it steers us wrong when we approach it that way. So the student asked, my experience as a woman has been that for many years growing up, I was told to suppress my anger, that I should not express anger, that, a good girl does not get angry. And then as I came into young adulthood, I, encountered spaces that encouraged me to express my anger and to express myself and to let my feelings out. And then I come into Reiki and it says, anger not. So like, how do I navigate all of that? And, for me, the clarity around that is really understanding what those precepts are inviting us into, which is much more similar to what you're describing. It's saying not to be attached to our anger. The word not in Japanese, the word that we translate into not when we translate it over into English kind of clumsily, actually means void or emptiness, which is a reference in Buddhism to basically the everything space that's inside of us, like the all things space that we all carry, that connection to everything. And so what it's saying is bring your anger into this space that holds everything and put space around it, put room, put spaciousness around it. Let it come up, move through, tell you what it's there to tell you, inform you, show you what it's there to show you, perhaps give you some direction on what you might do, what actions you might take, and then let it go. You know, don't grip it, don't stuff it, don't hold it inside, don't let it explode out of you in all directions unaccounted for. Let it be what it is. Give it space, respect it, pay attention to it, and then let it go. Don't be attached to it. So that's what that precept is inviting us into. And then from there, also into that space, gratitude, compassion, being true to ourselves. And when I understood that reframing of those precepts, it made everything so much more clear, and it made the whole system more accessible. Like, that sounds like something I could actually do. Like, not ever being afraid, not ever being angry, always being grateful, always being compassionate. That feels really out of reach, right? But I feel like I could do that. Like, I could use these embodiment practices to make it feel like there's enough room in my body to hold all of these feelings so that they can coexist and I can be more whole and more full, which is really the purpose of the system. And so it feels like, you know, working with Reiki in that way and working with yoga in the way that you're describing, with a mindset of making space for all of these parts of ourselves, is a pretty effective dynamite system, I would say. Yeah.
It sounds pretty great. As somebody who disassociated from my emotions and my physical body for many, many years, when I first started studying Buddhism, this idea of non-attachment kind of pushed me further into that, thinking like, I'm
Right.
just not going to feel, I'm not going to feel that. And that's how I understood it. It took me a long time to understand it the way that you're talking about that. And I think that's where the yoga practice comes in. When I'm, working with people on shadow discovery, the yoga practice is such an important part of it, because instead of getting caught in the theory of it, because it's a very interesting theory, shadow, when you start talking about it theoretically, it's fascinating. And so you
Yep.
can really get intellectual about it and then disassociate from it. So the yoga practice comes in, and when we're talking about anger, same thing for me as you were talking about one of your Facebook members. When I was a child, I was sent to therapy with my new family, but my brother was not sent to therapy. And a couple of years ago, I was writing this book, a memoir, and I asked the matriarch of that family what was behind the decision of sending me to therapy and not him. And she said, well, you were just so angry. And I said, well, he was getting into fights at school, but you didn't send him to therapy. And she's like, well, he's a boy. He figured it out. And so now I look at how that played out in our lives, and I'm doing a lot of self, discovery work, and he's caught up in the Tasmanian devil of rage, and doing his own work in his own way. But that idea of that girls aren't allowed to feel anger. And so it was something that for my whole life, I didn't think was okay for me to feel. And so the yoga practice has been such a big part of that. And for me, the way that I do that, and it's kind of what you're talking about in terms of Reiki and the Buddhist perspective, holding a container of space for all of that. What I do is I get on the floor on my back. This is my yoga practice when I'm feeling a lot of rage. And I sit in the physical sensation of anger and rage. And I feel it. And for me, what the image that starts to come to my mind and the feeling that comes in my body, it's usually around my chest area, is this kind of red smoke that really takes over. And so what I do when I'm sitting on the floor, feeling the groundedness, the firmness of the floor underneath me, I sit with that red smoke and let it be a part of what's happening. And what tends to happen, sometimes it's a little bit harder, but what tends to happen is it starts to dissolve and disappear. Not for good. It doesn't do it for good. It comes back. It's somebody that comes back to me. But in that moment, for a while, as I practice this, I allow it to be here with me. And I feel the heat of it, if you will. Heat, for me, it's a lot of hot, tightness around this area. And I just let that smoke circle the area of my body. And I just sit with that smoke for a little while. And what happens is a softening from it. And if that's what I can do for that day, then that's really good. Because then I'm not opening up, my studio door and walking outside and, sharpening my tongue on anybody else.
That's such a powerful description of an embodiment practice to enact these things that we're talking about. And I love the practicality of that. I love the simplicity of it. And it feels really related to the energy mapping system that we use within Reiki, which is called the three diamonds. And it's the energy centers of the belly, the low belly, the hara, the first diamond, the head is the second diamond, and the heart is the third diamond. And they're worked in that order for exactly what, for a lot of reasons, but in part what you're describing, that we have to, that in order to make space for these things, in order to be able to tolerate being in a cloud of anger and just be in that until it dissipates, we have to be well grounded, and we have to be well rooted, and we have to have our feet on the ground, and we have to be in our bodies. And there's this really beautiful acknowledgement within Reiki from its original perspective that isn't always present in its Western forms and in other kind of New Age spiritual practices that really emphasize the disembodied state, that emphasize the mind, that emphasize space and ascension and kind of leaving the physical realm. That makes me very nervous. It's not a perspective that I've ever felt gravitated to. And I really understand why now as I've been working in these ways, because, our safety, our foundation, our stability is in the earth, it's in our bodies. And so often our response to pain is to leave those places. And, what these practices that we're talking about give us is a way to stay on the ground and in our bodies, and at the same time move up and out and into that spacious place where there's enough room to hold what we are, and to explore, right? There's nothing wrong with being up and out and in vision and in possibility and in spaciousness. But if we're untethered from our bodies and from the ground, then again, we're not fulfilling our full potential. And then from there, from the balance of those two places, then we come to the territory of compassionate connection and of courage in our heart. And, I love looking at.
A bummer. You're saying as a way to stay. I was so interested in what you were saying.
Oh my gosh. I think somebody downstairs unplugged
it.
the internet or something. Like it just went away for a second and then just came back. So
here we are. We're back.
We're back. And the recording is still going. Good job, Zoom. Great, because I don't know how to splice two videos together. So
Oh, good.
Outside of my wheel set at this point.
I can now always show you how to do that.
Great. Yeah, that's like high on my list of priorities. Okay. Let's see. I had to
go back.
Compassionate connection. Okay. Let me call it back. So then we come back to the heart, to the third diamond and the territory of compassionate connection and of courage. And I love looking at the etymology of words. If we look at compassion, compassion, to be with pain, to be with our experience, our passion, ourselves and others. And the precept says, just for today, I'm compassionate with myself first. Oxygen mask on myself first, and then to others. And so this description of this practice of lying on the ground, getting grounded, getting connected to earth, letting this cloud of anger expand, do what it needs to do in that moment while you're in a grounded space. And I think you said the words, to be with yourself, to be with that experience. It's such a powerful example of compassion, of self-compassion, of being with your pain in the form of anger in that particular example. And to be with yourself in a grounded and supported way such that you come back into balance and equilibrium. And, to me, that's working the precepts, right? That's like being in the practice in a way that is simple, accessible, not necessarily easy, right? There's a lot in there that's not necessarily easy, but it is simple and it's accessible. And that's just, part of what's so beautiful about these practices. It's like with a little bit of knowledge and context and a little bit of strategy and technique, it's very simple to have these really profound impacts on our day-to-day life, on things that are entrenched for us, right? Things that have, been a thorn in our side and a real problem perhaps in our life for a very long time, decades maybe, that we can shift those things, those entrenched places in our life using these simple practices. But it does take a nuance of understanding, right? That shift in understanding from non-attachment means dissociation. Oh, great, I've been given permission to not feel my feelings, to non-attachment is not about not feeling them, but it's about not identifying them, like gripping onto them, making myself, I am angry, I am an angry person, versus, there's some anger here and it needs attention. So yeah, I'm so glad you shared that practical example, right, of how to walk through. And I wonder if there's any other examples like that that you'd like to share for folks. I know, kind of practical, like what does this look like, feet on the ground, to apply something from your work, some simple piece from your work in one's life.
Well, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking of a post that one of my yoga teachers posted the other day. Judith Lassiter, I trained with her for restorative yoga, and she posted a question that a student asked: "What do I do in Shavasana?" And she said, "You just lie there and watch yourself live."
Oh, I love that.
And it's such a great way. And it's the reason that I use restorative yoga is such a big part of the shadow discovery that I do. We do a restorative yoga practice where it's calming the nervous system. And you had mentioned something earlier about how, let me try to think of it. It was something about how we have stuff in our conscious and the shadow's still there, right? It's just in our subconscious, like it's still impacting our lives.
Right.
And that's why the yoga is such a big, important part of the shadow discovery. Restorative yoga, and then I use gentle yoga. Gentle yoga mainly for paying attention to sensation and what you're not feeling, like a really deep, slow practice of doing body work. But restorative yoga for the nervous system and addressing the nervous system. The shadows, that bag of shadows that's behind us is impacting us. Yeah. For me, that translated into a low tone of anxiety my whole life, that every now and then went up to higher anxiety and then low tone anxiety. But it wasn't until I started practicing restorative yoga that I could get my nervous system to a balanced level where my parasympathetic and my sympathetic nervous system were equally working in a very healthy way together. Yeah. And so people will come to a restorative yoga practice, which I have to say is the least practiced type of yoga in any yoga studio in anywhere in the world. I guarantee it. It's the least populated class.
That's because yoga is exercise, right? That's the point of yoga. Yeah. Is that it's for exercise, right?
I can guarantee you that if you come to a gentle yoga class of mine, you will feel like you've done more work than maybe you did in a vinyasa class. Nice. And you probably won't do hardly any, you'll be doing movement, but not as much. But I'm cueing you into paying such close attention to what's happening in your body, that the benefits of it and the feeling of it is more so than maybe if you went to a vinyasa. I love vinyasa. I'm just saying, I love vinyasa. I take vinyasa class all the time. But if you're just doing that without, and speeding through the movements, without paying close attention to each sensation and each shift of sensation that's happening, there's a lot to miss within that. And it's very similar to life and the energy that we live in life. And what I'm inviting you to do in these gentle yoga practices and the restorative yoga practices is slow down and challenge. People come to me and after a restorative yoga class, they'll say, wow, that was the most challenging class I've ever done. Mm-hmm. And we're doing 3 poses where you're just laying on the floor with pillows and blankets around you. And it's challenging because now they're witnessing what their mind's doing. It's like meditation. They're noticing how agitated they are by laying there. But with a little bit of practice, it becomes refuge.
Right.
It becomes a place to come back to yourself so that the next day, maybe you slept really well that night and you're not as reactive that day. And you've slowed down enough to be able to see what's the story that I just told myself. So when somebody says this thing to me at work and they say, like you were talking about that identification of like, I have anger versus I am an angry person. So if I do a restorative yoga practice and then the next day I go to work, or I'm consistently in it, next day I go to work and my boss says, you didn't get that thing done. I can just hear you didn't get that thing done instead of, why are you such a shitty employee? Right. Why are you such a failure?
Right.
And so with the combination of shadow discovery, learning about the history of the stories that I have about myself, and the yoga work addressing the nervous system, addressing the felt sense and how you're feeling your body and emotions, with the combination of all of those, in that moment, you start not hearing you're a shitty employee and you aren't reacting to it. And I'm not saying that never happens. I can still react to things. I still get triggered all the time, but I know exactly what my triggers are because I've done all of this work and I've prepared for them. And I'm skillful enough to be in the conversation about them afterwards with the person that I was reactive with, if that's the case. And my level of reaction isn't nearly what it used to be.
Right. Yeah, I mean, gosh, so much good stuff.
I know.
Like
There's
that's
so
why,
much.
the precepts very specifically say just for today, I anger not. And really what that means is just for this moment, right?
Mm.
It's not to say that you do it and then you're done doing it, right? It's like, yep, it's going to come back around, right? But just for this moment, I'm unattached to my anger and I'm able to hear the boss's words and not all of my projections about what that means about me as a person. And I'm able to keep my feet on the ground and I'm able to think clearly and I'm able to make a good decision and take good action to remedy whatever the situation is. Um, and and then this idea of like where we pay our attention, like what we are paying attention to is the key, right? So I love this description of restorative yoga. It's like so much about paying attention to what is happening inside and around us and how challenging that is because we're not encouraged to do that, right? Like you said, when your first therapist started asking you, where do you feel that in your body, and you're like, why would I know that? Like what are you
What are
even
you
saying right
saying
now?
to me? I don't know. I feel my head. My head hurts right now. That's all I know.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's a start, but this idea that we aren't well equipped to make that kind of internal assessment. And so to have the opportunity to do that and to slow down, as you say, and to really put in the work to pay attention, going slow, as you're saying, is sometimes the much, much more difficult way to go. I'm teaching a class right now on chanting with the mantra of Furomyo, which is an esoteric Japanese deity. And it's much harder to chant very slow than it
Mm.
is. Like once you learn the chant, like you want to just go, 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 go as fast as possible. But once we've memorized it and we can go fast, it's much easier to just put on that auto recording and go blah, 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 and let our mind check out again, right? Dissociate again, go somewhere else again, because our body can do the thing without our mind being involved. And so oftentimes, we have to know this. We have to hack ourselves and be like, okay, I know that about myself. Oh, aren't you clever? You memorized it. And so now you're really fast and you can just check out again. But the point of mantra is to protect your mind. The point of mantra is to keep your mind present here in this moment inside of this body, not to go off somewhere else and get into trouble, into anger, into fear, into all the things. And so sometimes we have to slow it way down and just like think really carefully about every motion that the mouth is making and every sound that we're making. And it's hard and it's uncomfortable and I don't like it. I want to be able to go fast. It's so much more impressive, I can chant these things fast. But I just, I guess I'm just kind of reflecting back agreement with you that restorative practice, is so valuable on so many levels and certainly about training our mind and where to pay attention. And so I heard you mention earlier that you offer restorative yoga in the park, in Land Park in Sacramento. So those of you who are local to our area, that is an incredible resource. But I'd love for you to just share some of the other things that you have coming up or that you do ongoing, both in person and online for those who are not in the area.
Yes, I just want to say it's not restorative yoga that I'm doing in Land
Oh,
Park,
thank you.
because I'm not bringing all the props out for
No
that.
problem. Got
So
it.
that's just like a regular, hatha yoga class. So it's, strengthening and movement. All of my classes I refer to as Shadow Alchemy, specifically because it's about this idea of calling really acute attention to what's happening. And one of the things that you had just mentioned that I wanted to say in the gentle yoga practices that I do, when you're talking about the chanting and speeding up and then slowing down, we do that with movement too. And so a lot of times I use that repetitive movement. So go back and forth doing the same movement over and over. And I've had students like, why are we doing the same thing over and over? And it's because I'm challenging you, because there's a moment we're going to check out and the movement's going to get really fast. And so it's paying attention to when that movement speeds up as a way to be like, oh, wait, I just checked out. So can I slow it down? Because we can't pay attention and be slow at the same time. I'm sorry, we can't pay attention and be fast at the same time. It's very much like if you're slow, it forces you to pay close attention. I think that's what I was trying to say.
That's
But
brilliant. Well, and again, just like
yeah,
one little piece on that, and like we could just riff off each other forever, but
I
just one little
know.
piece there, kind of, back to this idea of like the survival strategies that we have, as a brilliant creature that we are, it's part of our survival to be able to internalize something, get the muscle memory of something so that we can do it quickly while our mind is tending to other things, so that if something comes out at us, our body can just do the thing that it needs to do to intercept whatever's coming at us while our mind thinks of the next thing to do. It's a brilliant strategy, but it gets in our way when we're talking about these things that require us to be fully present and not doing all of these multiple things at once. And so it's like, again, we don't have to pick one or the other, one's good or one's bad. We can be so grateful for that strategy and that ability, that capacity that we have to be in multiple places at the same time. And we can recognize when that capacity is not actually getting us where we need to be, and we can employ a different strategy. So that intentional bringing in of a completely different strategy is so valuable. Yeah.
It's so true, because it's like this strategy of the next thing and being able to multitask is something that we need in life. But if what we're trying to do is create a better capacity to be here and be present and to find harmony as opposed to friction, then there's practices that we need to be doing to build the skill to be able to do that. And that's what I'm offering, our practices. And you spoke earlier about how it's not like a quick fix. And that is what my entire business is designed around, in terms of it's not a quick fix. This is a lifestyle. And it doesn't mean that we have to be, doing shadow discovery all the time and it's just practices to keep
Right.
to, because it's a cumulative effect. And so my online yoga studio I have online weekly classes where people can take classes with me, and I have other teachers to collaborate that I collaborate with. So somebody can either drop into a class or they can join a monthly membership and have access to all the classes all the time. In the monthly membership, we do a members circle where we set the tone every month for specific topics. So like this month, we're talking about our family of origin and sharing stories about our perspective, our relationship with our parents and our siblings, and how that played into our life today, so that we can start to think about these things. So we're like stirring up a little bit of the dust, so that in our yoga practice, we have things that we're working through. And then I have my Shadow Alchemy Program, which is a 6-week program that I do twice a year. It is also online. And this is really where it sets the stage for everything that we're talking about today. So it includes the theory of shadow. And I teach this methodology for how to go through different steps to discover shadows based on friction that shows up in your life. And then within that, we're doing yoga, and I'm doing one-on-one coaching with people. So there's group work, there's yoga classes, and then there's one-on-one work with me. So it's really kind of like the big kickstart of like, this is how it all gets set in place. And this is how we can start to look at these practices. And these are the tools that we can have so that we can find more harmony in our lives. And then the membership that I'm offering is the ongoing, here's a community of people that are doing similar stuff. And it's here for you when you want it. You can just come and do the yoga and keep that muscle working, that, metaphorical and physical muscle working in terms of doing that. Or you can take it higher and, attend the member circle and do more one-on-one stuff with me. And around Sacramento in July, I'm not sure when this is going to be posted, but I offer pretty frequently a class where it's restorative yoga, and I have massage therapists come around and give massage. And my friend Jeannie is there chanting mantra. About helping people to relax the nervous system. And so I'm doing a bunch of different stuff, and that's all up on my website. I do yoga in Land Park, where it's more of a hatha style yoga, just to keep that connection and keep doing stuff in person.
Beautiful. Well, we will put all of those links down below in the
Yep.
show description so that you can connect with Catherine and really feel into if this is the kind of work that you're ready for. I love that you're leaning into, this is slow, this is over time. That can be a real challenge from a marketing side of things, right? But on the
Oh,
other hand,
marketing.
right, like our soulmate customer knows that this is what they need, right? And are willing to commit the time and understand that this is about building lifelong practices and lifelong ways of being that shift us out of what perhaps has been a lifelong way of being that's not serving us anymore. And so, for those of you who might be feeling a little bit of a call towards that, or who just want to practice some yoga with some of these concepts as the framework, as the container in which that yoga is being practiced, please do reach out to Catherine and connect with what she's up to. It's really important work. So, Catherine, I'd love to just invite you to close by maybe sharing one final thing that you would like people to know about what it means to do shadow work.
Mm. There's so many things. Let me take a moment to think about that, if you don't mind. The one thing, and I think I just want to keep impressing this. I know I've said it a million times before, but and I'm really talking to the people that are like, yeah, that sounds something really cool, but I'm really a little afraid of it.
Yeah.
For me, and my approach to this is I want us to be happy and feel good in our lives. I want that for me. I want that for you. And so this work and this process isn't about, let's look at all the ways in which we're shitty all the time. It's really, let's just not be afraid of it. And let's do it together so that it feels a little bit more easeful. And yes, there's uncomfortable moments, but the goal is to have a better life, to have a better relationship with yourself. And so if it is something where it's like, yeah, that sounds good, but I don't know if I want to look at that thing that I don't like about myself, to remember that the container that I built and the container of who I am does not have that as the focus. The focus is a more loving space with ourselves. And that's always something that's brought in and reminded. And I always think of Anne Lamott's quote that rest and laughter are the most subversive acts. And I really use that as the mantra for the business. We rest and we laugh, even in the space of difficult things.
I love that so much.
Yeah.
Anne's always got some good gems.
Oh, she's the best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for this conversation. I know that we could continue following these threads for a good long time, and I hope that we will. After this video ends, I hope we'll continue this conversation and continue to work together in this realm because it really matters. So, friends, thank
Thank
you
you so
so
much,
much.
Michaela.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have had you. And I'm really grateful for those of you who are listening, who've gone on this little journey with us. I hope that something in this conversation has sparked something for you, has brought some value to your life, and has provisioned you as you move from this place. And so, as you move into your day, may you be deeply provisioned. Until next time, we love you. Goodbye.
Thank you.